The music you're listening to right now is the seminal work of Edgard Varèse, a composer who operated in the 20s and 30s and who's described by some as the father of electronic music. And, in fact, he was simply one of many classical music theorists and inventors of the early 20th century who bridged the gap and perhaps even created modern synthesizer music. Varèse's work and that of his contemporaries embodied a certain vision of music's future, often described aptly as futuristic music. Varèse perhaps focused less on music as product than on the production of music, incorporating ideas from the scientific method by suggesting that composition could or maybe should follow a literally experimental procedure conducted in a laboratory setting. He likewise titled his works in an austere fashion after scientific and mathematical concepts, including 1922's hyperprism, perhaps a reference to n-dimensional shapes and geometry, and 1931's ionizing radiation then being a relatively new discovery. The interest of Varèse and his peers in using unconventional objects as makeshift instruments engendered the development and broad acceptance of entirely new instruments and processes such as chance in the creation of music, culminating ultimately in the synthesizer. Prior to the synthesizer's invention, its coming was predicted by multiple proto-synthesizers. Russian inventor Leon Theremin, known for playing instruments of his own making to confused audiences from the 1920s onward, invented the atherophone in 1927. A year later, Maurice Martenot invented the onde Martenot, which could produce multiple varieties of wave, including sine and square waves, controlled by oscillators within the instrument. However, no person can lay greater claim to being the inventor of the synthesizer than German engineer Friedrich Trautwein, who invented the Trautonium. Having been commissioned by the Berlin University of the Arts, the instrument found its way into the hands of multiple mainstream composers, including one Paul Hindemith and his student Oskar Sala. While the experimental compositions of Varèse were met with scorn by critics and audiences, Hindemith's Concerto for Trautonium and Strings was positively received by concertgoers when it was performed in Munich in 1931. Unlike Hindemith's other compositions, Concerto for Trautonium sounds like a proof of concept, gentler, more traditional, and less dissonant than is typical for him, the synthesizer's flattering introduction to Western music. An equally essential movement around this time, that of musique concrète, began with the experiments of Pierre Schaeffer, who, in the 1940s, used manipulated gramophone records and found sounds sampled from both musical and non-musical sources to create what could be described as proto-ambient or proto-techno music. More than his predecessors, Schaeffer's work garnered a popular following in the cynical social environment of post-war France, including live performances and public talks, as etudes uncannily mirror modern sampling practices, slowing, pitching down or up, reversing, combining, and repeating short clips of other recordings to curate an unrecognizable result. More instances of the synthesizer's unlikely use in classical music were written by German musician Ernst Krenek, who, in 1964's surrealist opera Der Goldenbach, used electronic samples as stand-ins or sound effects for jet planes and barking, as well as electronically altered vocals, subtly pitched to fulfill microtonal lines. However, probably the greatest contributor to synthesis as music is Oskar Sala, the aforementioned student of Paul Hindemith, who was one of the first to compose and, in fact, specialize in fully synthesized music. Sala was equal parts musician and engineer, being the first to master Trautwein's Trautonium while iterating upon its design for prospective commercial use. However, the limited imagination of the public still cowed the Trautonium's recognition as a truly musical instrument. While Sala did compose for Alfred Hitchcock's famous horror film The Birds, he did not compose the soundtrack, rather creating the titular bird's hauntingly tortured screeches. The use of synthesizers in film did not become standard until amateur computer scientist and transgender icon Wendy Carlos scored A Clockwork Orange following the release of 1968's Switched on Bach, another installment in the then ubiquitous tradition of classical electronic, featuring compositions by Bach played on a Moog synthesizer. But now I think we should return to Edgard Varèse. One of the primary elements of a story which I neglected to mention was the destruction of his earliest works in a warehouse fire, a loss of intellectual property which I imagine might completely collapse one's ability or desire to create. Yet it seems to me that it merely instilled Varèse with a novel perspective on art. To me, Varèse is comparable to Sir Francis Bacon in the fact that both are, in a certain sense, non-participants in their own invention. Bacon discovered not science, but rather the scientific method. Likewise, Varèse wrote not music, but rather procedure for creating music. To someone like Varèse, for whom art, the product, the object, was fleeting and transitive, prone to destruction, it makes sense that mastery over how art is made was more essential than art itself. This introduction of, or perhaps simply the final acknowledgement of, the role of chance in art is its very essence. Roles are played at every stage by events ulterior to the artist's own genius, yet the product of the artist's happenstance seems to belong exclusively to them. To Varèse, I believe he thought his music was not his, but rather that he was merely an element which partially summed to that music, like fuel does to fire.